Hi, I'm Alex Knight. I'm the product manager at FeedPress and podcaster slash producer over at hologramradio.org. And today, what I want to do is walk you through what loudness compliance is, how that applies to your podcast editing, and why it's important. So, what is loudness compliance? Well, put simply, what it means is mastering your audio, your final product, to a set of established standards. Now, why would you want to do that? One of the biggest problems that I see with a lot of amateur podcasters that don't really have any audio engineering background or any podcast editing experience is they don't understand audio levels, which is they don't understand the optimal level that their audio should be processed at or even recorded at. For the scope of this podcast, what we're going to do is we're going to cover how to master your audio to a set of current podcast audio standards that will make all of your podcasts consistent in level, which means that your listener won't have to turn up the volume if it's too quiet, or on the flip side, turn it down if it's too loud. Now, this is a common problem that I see on a lot of podcasts, and I've spent a lot of time analyzing a lot of podcasts. And a lot of people that make podcasts, they're amateurs. They're not audio engineers. And I don't mean that in any kind of degrading way. It's just that is how it is. So what you can do with a little bit of knowledge is really take your skills to the next level to produce much better sounding audio. And that's what I'm going to walk you through today. All right, so let's jump in. Now, I'm going to be using Pro Tools to do this demonstration. And if you're not familiar with Pro Tools, it is the industry standard for recording software in the music industry. Now, I just happen to be using it for podcasts because I personally like it. It's my personal preference. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily better than what you've been using. There are other great professional programs out there like Logic, which is made by Apple. There's also very simple programs like GarageBand, which is free and comes with your Mac. And if you're on Windows, there are other cross-platform programs like Adobe Audition. So we'll focus on Pro Tools here, but the basic underlying concepts are the same pretty much in any recording software. You've got tracks that you record to, and you have a mixing window where you can control all the levels and volumes, and we'll go through that today. So I've set up just a basic empty session here. So we're going to have to import some audio. Now, like I was saying earlier, I had already recorded a podcast that needs to be edited, mixed, and mastered. So we're going to import that audio and work with it now. Okay. We'll bring up our import menu here. And now let's go to our podcast. And I'm going to grab the two tracks. So there's one track that is for me, and the other one is my co-host. That just takes a sec to process. Okay, so I've got my imported tracks here on my clip list here on the right-hand side. Now I need to create some new tracks. So I'm going to create two mono tracks. And they're audio tracks. Let's create those. All right, so let's give these a name. Michael's my co-host. Okay, so now we have our two audio tracks. Let's import our audio, just drag and drop. Okay, now I don't have to worry about anything like sync issues between these two tracks because they were recorded at the same time. So I just need to make sure that my audio clips are dragged all the way to the start of this session, which they are. Okay. So now we need a few other tracks, and I'll explain why. Now I'm going to show you how I set up and structure a podcast editing session. Now you can actually save these as templates, so I don't actually spend all that time doing it every time I record a podcast. It saves me a lot of time when you save a session as a template, which you can easily recall. So I'm going to set up a few additional tracks here. So for one thing, what I want to do is set up a auxiliary track. Actually, I'm going to set up a couple of auxiliary tracks. Now these are going to be stereo channels. All right. And we want a stereo master fader. The stereo master fader is pretty useful when you want to do things like lower or increase the overall volume of the entire session. You can also add plugins in the master fader as like the final chain of the mastering process, which is pretty handy as well. Okay, so I've got my aux tracks, which again are auxiliary tracks. I'll explain exactly what those do, so don't freak out just yet. Now I like to color code my tracks here. So let's give these tracks a unique color. Now, my audio tracks, I like to color a light blue. My auxiliary tracks, yellow. That's just personal preference. You can color them however you want. Let's give these aux tracks an intelligent name. So I'm going to rename aux1 to Loudness. And in a moment, I'll tell you why I'm doing this and what these are for. Aux2 is going to be bounce. Okay. So we'll deal with those tracks a little bit later, but let's take a look at our audio here. So I've got a podcast that's almost about an hour long here. And you can see from just looking at the waveforms, the levels are pretty good. I don't have any clipping, so there's tons of headroom to work with. Okay, so let's look at the two audio tracks that I imported for now. Now you can see here the levels are pretty good. They're not too loud. They're not clipping anywhere, but right now they're not optimized. So if we were to upload this podcast as is right now, it would be too quiet for our needs of mastering a podcast. Okay, so let's apply some processing to optimize these two individual audio tracks before we even get to the loudness compliance stage. Now, this step is really important. Now, I should say in this example, the two tracks that I have recorded here already had some compression applied during the recording from the outboard hardware that I have here. Now, that's done in real time. You might not have that. You might just be recording directly from your microphone straight into the computer dry without any effects or anything, which is totally fine because you can apply compression in the recording software that you're using whatever compression plugin that you prefer, or maybe it's just the one that's built into Logic or Pro Tools or Adobe Audition or whatever you're using to edit this stuff. Now, some of the tools that I'll be using here do not come with Pro Tools, and they are pretty expensive tools. Now, you don't necessarily have to use all of them, but these are the ones that I use. These are the ones that I like. Okay, so the first step here, in my particular case here, is to correct any phase issues. Now, one of the things that happens when you record a human voice is the human voice is naturally asymmetrical. Now, what that means is, depending on the person that's talking, when you actually record a piece of audio, if you were to look at the waveform, now let me just make this bigger so you can see what I'm talking about here. And it's kind of subtle, but you should be able to see it. So I'm going to zoom into two samples of audio so you can see what I'm referring to when I say asymmetric. So what does that mean? Well, if we look at these samples here and look at the center line, you can see on Michael's voice here, and this example is a bit of a more exaggerated one, where on the one axis, his voice is a bit louder in energy, whereas on the other axis, it isn't. Now, this poses a bit of a challenge, and when you get to the loudness compliance stage, which we will get to, where when you run the loudness compliance program, which analyzes the entire audio piece, it will apply a gain offset. So if your audio is too quiet, it applies additional gain to boost the volume to get it to the spec, the average perceptual volume spec that you want, which in our case is -16, which I mentioned at the top of this episode. So what can happen is, let's say someone yelled into the microphone. So you've got a piece of audio that's really, really, really loud. What can happen is, if you don't correct for the asymmetrical nature of that person's voice, when you run the audio through a loudness compliance plugin, what can happen is when it applies the gain offset needed to boost the signal, for example, to meet that average perceptual level that we're targeting, what happens is you can run into issues where the audio gets aggressively limited. And the reason for that is because loudness compliance plugins contain a true peak limiter. Now, what's a limiter? Well, the name kind of gives it away. It limits the audio, restricts it so that it doesn't go over a specific ceiling. So we'll go into that a little bit later. So I've got special software that can correct for these asymmetrical characteristics. Now, that's a plugin made by a company called Waves, which makes a lot of the plugins that I have here in Pro Tools. Now, this plugin is called InPhase. I'm going to bring that up now. Now, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details about how I set up this plugin or how it works, because that's a little out of scope and too technical for this video. But if you want to learn more about that, you can read a blog post that we published on FeedPress, which goes into how you can correct for the asymmetrical nature of the human voice using this particular Waves plugin. So I'm going to select the two audio tracks and just click render, which automatically applies the correction. Okay, so it is done, and you should be able to see the differences. Now, I'm going to just undo this so you can see the difference. Now, watch what happens when I undo. Watch the waveforms and how they shift. You see that? Okay, now we'll reapply the plugin processing. There we go. So now that's being corrected. All right, so now we can apply our EQ, or equalization. That's what it stands for. I'm going to use my favorite plugin, which is another one from Waves, which is their linear EQ plugin. So what does linear mean? Well, that just makes sure that any audio that passes through this EQ does not mess with the phase of it. And that's really, really important, because we actually just corrected for that. So we don't want to mess it up by applying EQ. So I have presets that I've set up, which I use quite often when working on my podcasts. Now, you can set up your own EQ. Now, this particular EQ, I've set this to just add a little bit more top end, a little bit more clarity. So this is a boost at 10,000 and 12,000 K. Now, it's very gentle, but it is noticeable. So I'll apply that processing now. Okay, so let's apply some compression. I'm going to use another Waves plugin that I really like, their API 2500. Now, we're not going into the nuances of compression, and I've mostly set up the plugin with the presets that I typically use. Now, this is very, very gentle compression. You won't really hear the difference. It's basically designed to clamp down on any transients, any peaks that I don't really want. And you can see there are a few of them in here. You can see, I'm going to highlight this section here where someone talked really loudly. And there was a section here, maybe someone yelled into the microphone. Not entirely sure without actually checking it. So let's apply the compression to the two individual tracks. Okay, so we can see that the processing has been applied. Once again, I'm going to undo that so you can see the difference and then reapply the processing. So let's undo that compression that we just did. All right, so hopefully you can see the difference. Again, we're not doing, it's not drastic. So let's reapply it. Undo, reapply. All right. Now, you can see it smoothed things out, but it didn't do a whole lot to this one section here, which is problematic. I'm not exactly sure what happened here. So let's actually take a listen. And for that, I need to put my headphones on. So let's do that now. Okay, let's see what happened here. Let's just play it from start of that. I think this is my voice here. This has got to hurt. Like I imagine if you're a DSLR manufacturer, this must not make you very happy.
I don't think they have anything to worry about just yet.
Okay, so that was like a sudden burst of speech there. So we can actually improve this, and we'll want to do this. You want to fix these types of problems before you really go any further in the mastering stage. So we can hear Michael took a breath right here. Now let me just solo his track. There's his breath.
I don't think they have anything to worry.
Okay, let's highlight that.
I don't.
Okay, so that's the section with the problem. Okay, so there are a bunch of different ways that you can approach this. A good way to maybe fix this is using something like a de-esser, which can sometimes fix stuff like this. Let's try. Okay. Now this particular de-esser I really, really like, which is made by Slate Digital. And a de-esser, just like it sounds, it will remove harsh sibilant sounds, that type of thing. And so what it does is it's actually really removing a lot of that harsh treble sound from a voice without making it sound unnatural. So let's see if we can actually get this fixed. So I'm going to increase the sensitivity and the amount of de-essing. Let's apply that. Well, that took it down. I bet that doesn't sound nearly as bad as it did before. Let's see.
I don't think they have anything
to... So it's not as bad, but it's still kind of harsh. There's another thing we can do here. We can also just do a very, very gentle fade in on that. So let's see if we can do that without making it sound unnatural.
I don't think they have anything to worry.
That's much less jarring. Now, there's more that we can do to fix that, but I'm just going to leave that now as is because it can take a lot more time to fix issues like that. But that's just one example. Now, let's get to the last portion of this, which is loudness. We've processed our audio and have optimized it as far as EQ and compression is concerned. But now what we want to do is we want to loudness optimize each individual track before we get to the final stage in this. So what I'm going to do is select the two tracks here, and I'm going to bring up a plugin by Nugen Audio called LM Correct. Now this is the plugin that I use for loudness compliance because it makes it super easy and it does the work for you. So the two presets that I have in this plugin, I have set up one for mono, one for stereo. So we're dealing with mono audio, so I'm going to select mono. So on the left-hand side source, that is the original audio, what it is at as far as overall volume. And then we have target, which is what we want to target our audio to. So I've set this to -2 dB TP, which stands for decibels true peak, the absolute maximum ceiling this audio will be set to. No samples in our audio will go above that ceiling. And that is really, really important because when we export our audio to MP3, which is what you should be doing for podcasts, we want to make sure that there's enough headroom so that when we compress our audio down to a lossy format like MP3, we've got plenty of headroom so there are no weird artifacts going on. Now, we talked about what LUFS means at the beginning of this session, which is loudness units relative to full scale. Okay, so there are two standards. There's one for stereo, one for mono. Now, the final product that I'll be producing is stereo, which I'll be targeting to minus 16. For mono, it's minus 19. Now, because we're working with two individual mono tracks here, and I'm going to select all of them, we're going to target minus 19. So what we're doing is we're just individually optimizing each mono track, targeting minus 19. So let's render these two tracks, which will take some time. And you can see there on the left-hand side in real time, the source, it's just analyzing the entire piece of audio. And we can see it's actually considerably quiet, way too quiet. So this plugin will apply the necessary gain to bring the levels up to the target that we want. The overall average perceived level of our podcast will be minus 19 for these individual tracks. Okay, we are done our loudness compliance processing to those individual mono tracks. So we're getting close to finishing now. So what we'll do is we'll now route the audio of these two tracks. So just watch this workflow here. I'm selecting the two tracks, Alex and Michael, and I'm going to route the audio of each individual track to stereo bus 1 and 2, which I've done here. And you can see it's output section here. It says bus 1 and 2. It can be any stereo bus on your audio interface that you want, but I'm just using 1 and 2. And then on the loudness auxiliary track, which we created at the beginning of the session, I'm going to set the input to stereo bus 1 and 2. So now on the loudness track, I'm going to apply one plugin, and I'm going to use my favorite compression plugin from Waves for this particular final stage of the mixdown, which is the CLA Mixdown plugin. Now, this is a stereo plugin because this auxiliary track is stereo. I don't use the bass and treble settings, so I'm going to turn those off, but I do use the glue and drive settings. What that means is basically glue is compression and drive is a pleasant analog distortion. It's a very pleasant harmonic distortion that you typically get on, vintage analog consoles. Now, this is not something you normally use for spoken word audio when you're mastering, but it's something that I use and I leave at the default 0, which sounds like it's not actually doing anything, but it is, and it's so subtle. It's not, you're not actually hearing distortion, but it's adding a pleasant harmonic distortion. It's just a character that gets applied to the audio that I really, really like. And as far as compression is concerned, I normally apply just a little bit of compression to sort of tame the overall audio. It's very, very light though, usually 2 or 3 dB worth of compression. And you'll see when I play this back how the compressor is working. So watch the VU meters here and this needle bouncing around back and forth.
This is an official legal disclaimer. Yeah, so 4K is basically taken over at this point.
So you can see I'm getting anywhere from around 2 to 3 dB worth of gain reduction. That's what these meters are showing you, how much the compressor is working and how much it's actually reducing. The reason why I've set up the compressor this way is because the combined amplitude of these two audio tracks can sometimes, for example, if two people are talking loudly at the same exact moment, sometimes that can create peaks that go above the threshold that we set earlier, which was -2. Well, you might be asking, how is that possible? We processed those two tracks. We set the max true peak setting to -2, so it should never go over -2. Well, yeah, individually, those tracks might not go above -2, but because the combined amplitude of those two can potentially be louder, we need to apply some additional compression to compensate for that. So that's why I've got this plugin on my loudness auxiliary track, and I've got a little bit of compression set just to clamp down on those peaks. So now that has been set up correctly, now we're going to get to the final stage. So to do this, we need to route the output of our loudness track to a different stereo bus. So we used 1 and 2 earlier. I'm going to use 3 and 4 now. And we'll set the input of the bounce auxiliary track to 3 and 4. So now what we need to do is bounce the audio to this track. So this is going to take the 2 individual mono tracks and bounce it to a new stereo track. So let's do that now. And I'm going to use the commit command. So we'll consolidate those tracks and render them now. So that might take a few minutes. Great, so here's our final bounced track. And what we need to do now is loudness process that track using our Nugen LM Correct plugin here. And the reason why we do that is because if you remember earlier, we individually processed those tracks that were mono to the mono target, which was -19. Now, because the final product is a stereo file, we want to target -16. So you can see from my preset here, I've got it set to -16. That's the target integrated volume that we want, the average perceived volume of the entire podcast. So let's go ahead and process that now. Fantastic. So I have my final process stereo podcast, loudness optimized to -16 LUFS. And now we're almost ready to export it. So I'm going to insert our final dithering plugin. And I'm using the Waves L2 limiter plugin. I'm not actually using the limiter portion of the plugin to boost anything. All I'm doing is dithering down from the 32-bit session. So I'm going to change it to 16 bits and close the plugin. And that's generally recommended if you're working in really, really high bit rates, like 24-bit, 32-bit, dither down to 16-bit and change your sample rate, of course, if you're working with anything higher than 44.1. So in this particular case, my final product is going to be a stereo MP3, 16-bit, 44.1 kilohertz. That is a CD quality standard as far as bit rate and sample rates are concerned. And I'll just export this audio to an MP3. So with Pro Tools, we can actually export both the original WAV file and to an MP3. So I'm going to do both. For format, I'm going to choose interleave, which is stereo basically, bit depth and sample rate. So let's talk about that. I'm going to set it to 16-bit, 44.1 kilohertz. As far as bit depth and sample rates are concerned, you don't need anything higher than that for a podcast. It's a complete waste. Do not do that. Although most devices these days will play audio that has higher bit depths and certainly higher sampling rates, like 48 kilohertz, you don't need it. It's a complete waste for an audio podcast. I see so many podcasters do this. I think they just completely ignore it because they don't really understand what this is. So just dither down to 16-bit, 44.1 kilohertz. That's what you need your MP3 to be at, and it'll play back properly. And of course, let's give our file a name. I've already got one here, which just takes the session name here, which in this case is Loudness Compliance Tutorial. And we can choose the directory where it's going to spit out the final MP3. I'll leave it to the default and click bounce. So the reason why we're getting prompted for another dialogue here is because we need to enter the very important metadata for the podcast. So that's the title, that's the artist, album, comments, track information. Well, you probably won't be entering track information, except for maybe the year. So I'm going to leave the title intact here. Artist, I'm going to put Alex Knight, that's me. You might put the name of your podcast here. The album, you don't really need, it's really not that important. Title and artist are probably the most important, so you get attribution for that. Genre, you can ignore that. Track information you don't need. The year, I always like to put the current year that the podcast was produced in, so 2018. And now, of course, the bit rate. Now, This is personal preference, but for a stereo podcast, I like to use a generally higher bitrate than what a lot of podcasters use. I know a lot of people use 128, which is okay. As far as the bitrate is concerned, I like to use 192. This is personal preference. I know some podcasters like 128 or slightly lower. I generally don't like to go lower than 128. 128 would be the minimum I would recommend for an audio podcast that's a stereo file, especially one that contains music. Just anything less than 128, it's going to sound kind of crappy. And yes, your file size will be smaller. So if you're constrained by storage space, if you have a podcast host that charges you a lot for storage space, maybe you'll want to make it slightly smaller. But it's not a problem for me. I have lots of storage space at FeedPress. Actually, we give people, full disclaimer, I am the product manager there. So I'm going to tell you that FeedPress is the best, but we give everyone 400 megabytes of file storage, which is plenty of storage if you're doing a weekly podcast. I never go over that limit when I encode my MP3s at 192. All right, we're done. Congratulations, you've now mastered a podcast to the current recommended loudness compliance settings for podcasts, which is -16 LUFS. This is a standard that I'm hoping more and more podcasters adopt. It's starting to get more widespread usage, but there are still far too many amateur podcasts that don't know anything about it. So hopefully you have some additional skills in your tool belt now that you can use to apply to your own podcasts. And maybe you can go back and remaster some of your old podcasts and make them sound a little bit better, which will be better for your listeners anyways, because it means that when they're on their commute to work, either on the train, maybe they're working outside or walking to work, for example, they won't need to fiddle around with the volume on their phone when they're listening to your podcast, which is always great. It just means a better overall listening experience. We'll be doing other videos in this series on podcast editing and mixing and mastering, so be sure to stick around for those. I'm Alex Knight for FeedPress and Hologram Radio. See you next time.